We're going to kick off the evening with Tom Peters, the CEO of Marin Community Foundation. He's going to welcome all of you to this event and get us started.
Thank you all very much. Glad to see everybody out on this critical topic. And I'm here with my colleagues from the Marin Community Foundation, and on their behalf, as well as on behalf of our co-sponsor, Dominican University, who also chipped in a fabulous haul for us to discuss. We really want to appreciate Omar, folks at the Canal Alliance for the forethought in convening us. Certainly want to thank the partners that you worked with closely in establishing this. Can I just read them off? West Marin Community Services, Marin City Community Development Corporation, North Marin Community Services, and the Marin County Office of Education. Really appreciate all the work that is there, and also want to acknowledge and give a call out to elected and appointed public officials who are with us, and of course representatives of so many of Marin's outstanding cohort of nonprofit organizations. It's one of the strengths of our community. And we're going to need everybody in that list and more for the topic that we're gathered. You know, when Jonathan and Patty came to see me about this event and pointed out that the title was Make Marin Count, I thought of the word count in sort of an unusual way. This will throw you back to grade school English class, but count is a word that can be used in several different ways. Noun, as a verb, even as an adjective. And I started thinking about how appropriate that is with regard to the topic that we've got tonight. One is, just thinking of the count as a noun. It's the product. It is the name of the product that we need to chip in our part to make the United States Census of 2020 as complete a count as it possibly can be. The U.S. Constitution requires an interesting bit of specificity in the Constitution. It requires that it be a count of all the people, not some of the people, certainly not just someone's idea of preferred people. It's to be a count of all the people in the United States on a given day so that there is an accurate count. That's the product. That's the noun involved here. And, in spite of the chicanery and duplicity of some federal officials, unnamed, the census is to be without impediment a total count of all persons. But that word count is also a verb, and that is a very critical aspect of why we're gathered here today. A second use of the word count is verb, a verb of action. Our expert presenters this afternoon will be setting the stage for ongoing action, concerted, determined, and in many cases, difficult action. Census counting will be challenging, and not only because of the sheer size and scope of the numbers involved. The challenge will be greater because of our society's inequity. There are many, many people who, through no fault of their own, are considered, quote, hard to count, hard to reach, hard to engage, hard to elicit trust. Folks with challenges of language, disabilities, or lack of stable housing. People of various color, ethnicities, and religions who have been systematically and categorically demeaned and discriminated against. People who have every reason, sadly enough, every understandable reason to be suspicious and even fearful of filling out a government form. Now, finally, the word count is also an adjective, and this is the thing that I think about the most with regard to the job that we have in front of us. Count is an adjective. It's a word that connotes a measure of significance, that you matter, you have value, you count. And this is perhaps the most critical aspect of the work that lies ahead of all of us. Reaching out with empathy to people who may not ever have felt included, only ignored. Reaching out to those who have suffered the indignities of powerful people in high stations who, by their thoroughly noxious statements, have made some in our country feel marginalized, scapegoated, or devalued. So it will be critically important, as Omar has reminded us in his very excellent piece in the IJ yesterday, that everyone in this room can exercise a key role, the role of trusted voice. Trusted voice. No guarantees, no false assurances, but what we can indeed do is emphasize that each person in our community deserves to be counted, deserves to be included, to be welcomed and respected, because each one of our neighbors, without exception, definitely counts. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I get the good honor of introducing two dynamic people, Stephanie McNally and Carla Hernandez Navarro. Wait, where's Carla? Is she coming up?
Where's Carla?
Carla, I was just talking to Carla. She
There she is.
must have been something I said. Carla, come on up here. All right, let's have a hand for Carla as well. Would you guys take over from here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Carla, by the way, I should mention, Carla has got a 1 foot here in the university and 1 foot at Canal Alliance. And John and Patty and I were talking about the fact that we were a little worried she didn't have enough to do. So help her out tonight. A fantastic job, and we thank you both for all the work that went into convening us and now kicking us off. Okay?
Great.
All right. Thank you very much.
So before I introduce our speaker, I want to let all of you know that you have an opportunity to submit questions this evening. You look like a group that has a lot of questions. So we have volunteers with index cards and pens, so you can submit questions during the evening. We'll probably wrap that up just before the question and answer session. Chances are there might be more questions asked than we can answer or that we're able to answer this evening. So if we don't get to your question, we will post it on our website. The information for our website, the link where we'll be posting information is on the back of your program. But it's also, if you just go to the Canal Alliance website, you should be able to find it. So hopefully we'll get to everyone's questions. You'll get the answers you came here for this evening, but if you don't, we will definitely provide information afterwards. So right now, I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening for our impact overview, and actually, our census impact. So this evening, Dr. John Dobard will be speaking to you. He's the Associate Director of Political Voice at the Advancement Project California, and he's going to give you an overview of the 2020 census from the state perspective. So John, if you can come up here. Here's the clicker to advance, okay?
Okay.
This guy? And if you get stuck, I'm right there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Good evening. Good evening. All right, all right. So as Stephanie mentioned, I'm with the Advancement Project California, which is a multiracial civil rights organization that works with community partners across the state to transform public institutions and shift investments to achieve racial equity. We do that work primarily through policy advocacy in 4 issue areas. One is education, another is public funding, a third is health, and a fourth is democracy. Our democracy work, our democracy reform work, is housed in what we call our Political Voice program, and that's the program that I lead. Political Voice focuses primarily on 4 issues. One is public participation in governance, another is voting and election systems. We do work around redistricting, and we also do work around the census. As part of our census work, we're doing primarily 2 things. We're working on the policy advocacy side and also on the field outreach side. On the policy advocacy side, we are convening a coalition of statewide and national organizations in California called the Census Policy Advocacy Network, or CPAN for short. CPAN is working to educate policymakers and community leaders about the government investment and sound policies needed to achieve a fair and accurate count in 2020. So we're doing that on the policy side, and we're working statewide, but also with actually a national coalition as well. But our efforts, while we're working with that national coalition, our efforts are more focused on the state. So we were pleased to see the state invest $3 million last year for a census outreach program, and then $90.3 million this year for a census outreach program. On the field outreach side, we're working much more locally. We're based in LA. We are convening what we call the Los Angeles Regional Census Table, and that's a space for nonprofits and community-based organizations to come to share resources, share knowledge, but to also coordinate outreach efforts. Coordinate amongst each other, but also coordinate with the county and the city. So the county and the city are members of the table, and the table also doubles as a subcommittee of the county-wide Complete Count Committee. So we're working, as I said, on both sides, policy advocacy and on the field outreach side. This evening, in the time allotted, I'm going to say a few things about why the state of California is at a high risk for an undercount in the 2020 census. But I'm going to begin by saying a few things about why the census matters. So the census is constitutionally mandated, and that's important, but that's not ultimately why it matters. The census matters because of how the data are used. And the data are used primarily in 3 ways. One has to do with political power. So census data are used to reapportion seats in the House every 10 years. Census data are also used to redraw district boundaries at the federal, state, and local levels every 10 years, but sometimes there are changes that happen between the normal cycle. Another way it's used is to protect or enforce civil rights laws. So we use that data to enforce equal protection, employment, other types of civil rights protections. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly for many folks, census data are used to guide the allocation of federal funding. So if you think of issues of health, education, transportation, housing, census data plays a role in guiding funding for those and many other areas. So some of the programs are SCHIP, so the State Children's Health Insurance Program, Section 8, Medicaid. Those are just a few examples. Head Start relies on census-derived statistics. In 2015, California received approximately $76 billion just from the 16 largest federal programs that rely on census-derived statistics. So that's just the 16 largest. There are many other programs that rely on census data, but that just gives you a sense of, in terms of dollars and cents, what's at stake. And again, that's 1 year. In order for California to receive its fair share of political representation and federal funding in the decade after 2020, the Census Bureau must count all of our state's residents accurately. But there are 3 factors that are converging that are going to make it difficult for the Census Bureau to do that. Those factors are our demographics, innovations by the Census Bureau, and shifts in the federal landscape. And I'll talk about each one of these. With respect to the first factor, our demographics, California is the hardest to count state in the country. And the reason for that is that we have a high concentration of what are known as hard to count populations, or HTC populations. In a nutshell, an HTC population is a population that is less likely to participate in the census for various reasons. And the reasons aren't all the same. Some are across groups, but others are unique to particular populations. But in a nutshell, an HTC population is a population that's less likely to participate or self-respond in the decennial census, and therefore harder for the Census Bureau to enumerate. We have a lot of those folks. We not only have a high number of individuals that fall into an HTC category, we also have a diverse range of those populations. And so it's not just the sheer number, it's also the fact that there are, again, unique circumstances that explain why people are less likely, and so for outreach to be effective, you need outreach that's targeted to those different groups. And so we have a large number, and we have variation. CPAN estimates that there are at a minimum, 15.1 million Californians that fall into an HTC category. This is at the low end. There are other analyses that have a much higher number, but we're saying that this is the baseline, that 15.1 million fall into a category, an HTC category. And we break that up. That can be broken down into two categories. For our analysis, we use two categories. One category is made up of folks who live in hard-to-count census geographies. All right, so the Census Bureau will assign geographies a score that ranks how hard they are to count. So when you think of the hard to count, that's one way of thinking about it, whether or not people live in a hard-to-count census geography. And for the 2020 census, the Bureau is using what they call the low response score metric to rank these census geographies. So you can have a census tract that has a very high low response score, high low response score, moderate low, et cetera. If you look at the population living in high and very high LRS tracts, that's that column. Obviously, majority of folks that are hard to count live in a hard to count census geography. But we think it's important to also note that there are a lot of people who live outside of those geographies who are also hard to count, right? So when we're thinking about who we need to reach, we can't just look at census geographies that have high and very high LRS scores. We also need to be thinking more broadly. So we need to be thinking again in terms of HTC populations, and also thinking about who falls into an HTC population but may not live in a hard-to-count census geography. So that other column of folks living outside, that includes, and because of time and resources, we could only look at one factor. So that includes Latinos who are non-citizens, Asian Americans with limited English proficiency, African Americans and blacks living below the poverty line, whites living below the poverty line, and then for Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, this includes those total populations, because both of those populations are simply hard to count, period. So again, we have high number and a lot of diversity. One of the reasons, if you think about why people are less likely to respond, you might think it's apathy, and there may be some of that, but there's a better explanation, and it has to do with barriers. We know what some of the common reasons are for people not participating, and it boils down to barriers. Some of those common barriers are uncertainty about the purpose and use of the census. People don't know about the census. Another is uncertainty about who should be included. This is one factor that explains why young children get missed, is that the head of household or whoever's filling out the questionnaire doesn't know that young children should be included in the census, in the response. Fear, mistrust of government, and finally, limited English proficiency. Again, are some common barriers. So the challenge that we face in California is going to be to help the 15.1 million, at a minimum, overcome those barriers and participate in the census. But there are two other factors that are exacerbating our risk and are going to make that difficult. The second of the three factors comprises shifts in how the Census Bureau will administer the upcoming census. The 2020 census is going to be unlike any other in our history. Part of that has to do with what the census is calling these innovations that it's going to implement, and that's the four you see up here. So new methods for updating the master address file. The master address file is the database that the Census Bureau uses to contact folks. If you're not on there, if your address isn't on there, the Census Bureau will not interact with you. So it's going to be, instead of having staff or Census Bureau employees walk 11 million census blocks to check addresses, the Census Bureau is going to be using GIS, aerial imagery, administrative records, and third-party data. Right? Issue with that is that is not necessarily always accurate, and it also can miss non-traditional housing. Right? Another shift is that the Census Bureau will be really encouraging people to self-respond via internet. So this is a big change that's coming. It doesn't mean that that people cannot respond via paper questionnaire or via phone. It's just that the Census Bureau is going to heavily encourage internet self-response. Some communities will receive, so everyone's going to get a packet from the Census Bureau. That packet will, for some people, it will just encourage you to go online and fill out your form. For other communities, it will include the paper questionnaire. Right? So we don't yet know which communities are going to receive what yet. That's something that the Bureau is still working on. A third factor is the expansion in the use of administrative records and third-party data to do a number of things, but part of that is to verify responses and then to also target outreach in what the Census Bureau calls its non-response follow-up operation. And that's the operation that happens basically April to July. So when you think of the Bureau sending enumerators out, what that usually refers to is the non-response follow-up operation. And so that's after people have had a chance to self-respond, then the Bureau starts contacting folks with calls or sending people to homes. The Bureau is going to be using, again, the third-party data, administrative records to help fill in some gaps. A fourth shift will be a reduction in field staff. You're going to see less enumerators. And that's, again, supposed to be supplemented by this third-party data and administrative data. Another shift that's happening that isn't included in what the Bureau is calling its innovations is the Citizenship Question, which I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard about. So in March of this year, the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, directed the Census Bureau to add a question about citizenship to the 2020 Census Questionnaire. You can see what the question is here. Formally, that was a response to a request from the Department of Justice, but we know now that actually that Wilbur Ross and his staff were considering this prior to that DOJ request, and in fact, encouraged the DOJ to submit a request to have this question added. There's currently litigation happening right now in a number of different states to get this question removed. There's also various advocacy happening to get this question removed. We will know by April of 2019 whether or not this will be on. The third factor comprises shifts in the federal landscape. In there, I'm talking about four things. One is shifts in federal immigration policy. So we know about the Trump administration's executive orders, right, and the fear that that's caused in immigrant communities and among mixed status families. That's not helpful, and it's not conducive to full census participation. A rise in Islamophobia. We've seen that occur. We've seen Trump's attitude and stance toward the religion, despite his shift in tone last year during his trip to Saudi Arabia. But that shift has also generated fear in a community that is now probably less likely to participate in the census. Funding for the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau has been underfunded for several years, and it's already had an impact. Fortunately, 2018 was a better year for the Census Bureau, and we think 2019 might be, but the damage of years of underfunding has been done. And the Bureau has made adjustments based on that. We hope in the coming years that the Bureau will, and folks are fighting to ensure that the Bureau gets what it needs to no longer have to make the cuts that it has made, and to ensure that it has the resources it needs to carry out the work that it needs to do. Lastly, there's a void in leadership at the Bureau. Last year, John Thompson resigned as the director, and there has been last June, John Thompson resigned, and there's been a void in leadership since then. That's problematic because the Bureau doesn't have someone that's going to fight for it in Congress and with the White House to ensure that it gets the funding and resources that it needs. There is someone being considered. There's not much known about this nominee at the moment. There are groups monitoring this. We will see what happens in the coming months and see if this person is confirmed and whether or not there should be more vocal opposition to this nomination. So we have a lot of factors going against us in California, and the challenge before us is really immense. It's a massive task to reach the number of folks that we need to reach in the ways that we need to reach them to encourage them to participate in the census. And it's promising, though, that there's a lot that already has happened to mitigate the risk, and there's a lot that many of you in this room can do to further mitigate the risk and ensure that we have a complete count. And I look forward to talking about much of that during the panel, and thank you.
Great, thank you, John. Good evening, I'm Patty D'Angelo Watchin, and I'm a program director at the Marin Community Foundation. It's been a real pleasure to partner with Canal Alliance in planning this event, and I wanted to give a special shout out to Stephanie, who's demonstrating her agility here. And thank you, Stephanie. And to Carla Hernandez, Dominican intern, who's just really stepped up and kept a lot of the momentum going and our excitement for tonight. So before, let's see, clicker. Before we go into our panel, my job is to help ground the discussion in the context of Marin County. So John set a great stage for us, talking about California, and now I'm going to walk us through how the hard-to-count population configures in Marin. And I will say the data that I'm drawing from is from a map application that was developed by the City University of New York. It's a little bit different in terms of the statistical model that is used by the Census Bureau. So there are some differences, but I think essentially we can cover some good ground to help us in our understanding of where the hard-to-count populations are in Marin. Oh, thank you. So overall, and I should say, there are runners. Can you raise your hands? Folks with the 3x5 cards, if you have questions that come up during the presentation, you're welcome to just raise your hand, ask for a 3x5 card, and they'll collect it and collate it and then hand it to me when we're transitioning into the Q&A portion. And whatever questions we don't get to tonight will be posted as a follow-up on the website of Canal Alliance. So in 2010, Marin County had a response rate of 81.1%. So commendable by any measure. But as with many stories in Marin, it gets a little more complicated as you look more closely at the data. So I hope you can see some of the, I'm actually going to skip ahead. So John mentioned hard to count populations and geographies. The characteristics that we think of when we think about hard to count include young children, communities of color, urban and rural, low income, immigrants, renters, high-density housing inhabitants, households with limited English proficiency, low educational attainment, single-parent head households, homeless folks, veterans, and seniors. Do we have those folks in Marin? Yes. Young children are the most undercounted age group in the census historically and nationally. So just to, again, kind of highlight a little bit of statistics, in Marin, 37% of Marin's households are renter-occupied. 20% of our county's population are foreign-born. 11% of our households are headed by single parents. And of those, 59% include children under 18. When we think about communities of color, we have 16% of our population being Hispanic, regardless of race, 4% identifying as Black, 8% as Asian, 1% as American Indian. We have 8% that live below the poverty level, and another 11% that are between 100 and 200% of the federal poverty level. 5% have limited English proficiency. 5% of our population is under 5. So you start to see the relevance, even outside of the particular tracks of this conversation for our county. Go back one. So for the purposes of this map, a census tract is considered hard to count if the self-response rate, right, that mail-in rate in 2010 was 73% or less. And that's the threshold that represents the bottom 20% of the mail return rates in 2010. I'm going to skip ahead. So this is what we have emerging for Marin County. Excuse me. There are 4 census tracts that the City University map identifies as being hard to count. The distinction with the Census Bureau's mapping model is a little bit different. The top 2 census tracts, or the lowest two census tracts, are the same, and then there's a difference between a third census tract that's identified in Santa Fe. But I'll focus on the data that we have. Marin City coming in at the lowest, 66.9% return rate. The Canal, 67.7%. And then 2 other tracts in San Rafael, Lincoln Avenue and Francisco West Boulevard area, in the low 70s. Within those population tracts, there lives 7% of our population, representing about 19,000 people who live in hard-to-count neighborhoods in the county. So that is the context for Marin County. That's a good segue for us to move into our panel discussion, so I'm going to invite our panelists to the stage. And let's see, maybe if Leah, I think Leah's going to go first, so where's Leah? Yes, so come on up on the stage, there's steps here. And as they're coming up, I will introduce them. Leah Bolden is a partnership specialist with the Bay Area U.S. Census Bureau. This is her 4th census.
Wow.
Just amazing. Yes, I will pass it. Dr. Robert Eiler is the chief economist at the Marin Economic Forum and a professor of economics at Sonoma State University. Paul M. Cohen is the principal of PM Cohen Public Affairs, a political consultancy. Kristen Drum is the senior planner with the Community Development Agency here in Marin. So I'm going to first, Leah is going to kick it off for us, talking about just grounding us in the process that the census uses to ensure an accurate count and the timeline for that. And then we will go into deeper detail around the economic and political ramifications of the census. And then Kristen will round us out around local efforts around complete count. And then we will transition into Q&A.
Thanks, Patty. So I have about 10 slides that I have to do in 4 minutes. So I'm going to do my best.
I'm going to do just a mic check. Can folks hear Leah?
Can you hear me okay?
So maybe bring it closer to you.
Can you hear me better now? I need it up. I need to hold it, huh? Can you hear me now? All right. Okay. So I'm Leah Bowden, the Partnership Specialist with the Los Angeles Regional Census Center. The Los Angeles Regional Census Center covers 7 states: Alaska, Hawaii, California, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. So you can see on the first slide, our job is to count everybody once, only once, and in the right place, and that's going to be our goal. The 2020 census is less than 2 years away. 140 million housing units, over 313 million people. We will hire about 300,000 people nationally, and our intention today is really to engage you in the possibilities of how we can get a full and accurate count in your community here in Marin County. And I just want to do a shout out. I went to high school here at Tamalpais. I ran on the track team, so this was my home, and so I love Marin County. Okay. So one of the things that we know for sure is the census is planned nationally. We've been planning the census since 2012, but it happens locally. We cannot do it without local support. We've been planning the census, and since in 1980, we recognized the need for a partnership program, that we needed to go grassroots. Next slide.
Good.
Oh, I get the click.
It's forward on the right-hand side.
Okay, great.
There you go.
I'm not going to go through all of this. You can see our first line. What our mission is to really be the leading provider of quality data about the people in our economy. And I just want to point out that, one of our strong talking points, we talked about, why the census is important. We talked about the $675 billion that comes back to state and local governments based on census data. But one of the things is, so Title 13 is the law that mandates us to complete the form, and it also mandates that the Census Bureau is required to keep your information confidential, and all responses to the questionnaire are kept confidential for 72 years, as mandated. We never share a respondent's individual, personally identifiable information to other governmental agencies. All census employees swear a lifetime oath to protect respondent information. Penalty for wrongful disclosures up to 5 years imprisonment or a fine of $250,000. So that's going to continue to be a strong message about why we keep your answers safe. I'm going to go to this next slide here, back up here. Okay. So what is the Community Engagement and Partnership Program? That's what I'm a part of. And I put this here because it says who we are and what we do. Okay, so you can see here in terms of just looking at census staff, we have partnership specialists in every state. We'll have 300 for the for the Los Angeles region. We'll have tribal specialists to reach out to people in Indian country and urban Indians, of course. We also have data dissemination specialists that can come and talk to you about the uses of census data and how to use census in grant writing. We're going to have support from complete count committees. And that's one of the things that is really foremost on my plate right now, is working with local counties and cities to form these complete count committees that actually establish the framework and unification of communication and outreach in their communities. Because why? They know their communities. And we want to be at the table with them across all parts of our operation. We'll have a national ad campaign. We have national partnerships programs. We're working with corporations. And then we'll have lots of promotional items, as we had in 2010 and also in 2000. But the point is, what Tom Peters had mentioned, our job is to find the trusted voices, the trusted leaders, recognizing that at this point in time, that's probably not us. Not that the government has ever been the trusted messenger. We've done a number of decennials since 1790. It's always been tough, but we know that locally, it's those local leaders, it's that church person that can actually minister, that can actually, really get their communities to be counted. So that's 4 minutes already. Okay, Ray, did you want me to stop or you want me to
Leah,
finish?
why don't you keep going? I think you have a little bit
great.
more. We'll give you another
Okay.
minute.
So, I needed 20 minutes like John. I mean, you can't just do the census in 4 minutes. Like I said, we've been planning this thing since 2012. What's new is for the 2020 census is we have more partnership staff. The partnership staff is the ground game. Recognizing that we're going to have a diverse team that are going to work with local community organizations to ensure that we identify those trusted messengers and we are able to implement some key elements, working with schools, faith-based organizations, community organizations, LGBT groups, et cetera. It's going to be the most accessible census in history. The 2020 census will feature an internet self-response option, making it easier for anyone to respond at any time. We're going to leverage digital and social media to tailor direct messages. And you can see here that we're spending more money on our ad campaign because we recognize the need to have a direct message across the board to all of our communities. So, in 2010, we filled out a paper form. Okay, it was a mail-out, mail-back survey. We can see here, we had to step up to our digital age, and Congress asked us to do that. So you will be able to go online and fill out the form, as most people do. You can fill it out with your phone on an iPad. You can also call the 1-800 number and get your form answered on the phone. Or you can actually request a paper form if we didn't send one to you. And then fourthly, it's non-response follow-up. We will actually send someone to your home to capture the data. And I won't go through this slide, but I just want to say that the Census Bureau looks at our data. We look at the American Community Survey, which goes to 3.5 million people a year, and which gives us our trend data. So we understand languages. And so we put that data, and we see that we're going to actually have the online tool in these 12 languages, and then we have some other support materials, language glossary, language guides, and ID card, and you can see that's in the 59 languages. I'm sorry that's hard to see, but you can go online, and it's all spelled out for you. Okay, this last one, I'm getting to the end here. I can't go through all of these points, but we're early in our planning for the census. Sometimes, people ask me a lot of detailed questions, and one of the things I can say is our final operational plan won't be out until December. So we're still fine-tuning how we're going to conduct the census. So one of the things we can see here that we are coming off of our 2018 end-to-end test. We had about a 52.3 response rate. We had expected 49. So we did a little bit better than we had thought. And mail response, self-response on internet was 61%. So you can read about that too.
Leah?
Yeah.
Can you advance one slide? You're one slide behind here.
Sorry, I missed it. Okay, right, here we go. And this slide is probably online as well. Thank you for that. I can't see in back of my head. One of the things that we're doing is we're standing up a local census office in Oakland. We're actually going to have a kickoff next week. We're going to have 26 offices in California. And we're working with complete count committees. There's 39 states that have agreed to do that. And 11 are considering, and I'm working with Northern California on forming those complete count committees now. Complete count committees, as I mentioned, really create the framework and the unification of the community outreach campaign because they know their community and they can coalesce all of the community leaders in one place to begin to have a dialogue about the highest and best way to get your community counted. Okay, I'm not going to go through this, but I wanted to point out that we have a recruiting slide, as a recruiting site that just launched. So you can see that, the 2020 census /jobs. And then you can see that 1-800 number that just kicked off as well. So if you're interested in jobs, we're starting to hire. You can go online and begin that process. And you can see the types of jobs that we have. And I'll be here if you want to talk with me more about it. And there was a contact slide on the end. You're welcome to contact us if you have any questions or insights or just want to call me and have a conversation.
Great.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Dr. Eiler.
So folks, I was asked to answer a couple questions from an economist standpoint and from a business standpoint. The first one was, how do local and regional businesses factor census results in their planning and decision making? And one approach to this is to think that it's constant and there's myriad uses of this. The four major categories of census data are social, demographic, economic, and housing. So in fact, not only do we count people, we actually count the inanimate objects in which we live, which are our houses when we are homed, which is another population that also struggles to be counted, which is the homeless. And if you know the Marin County situation, we've had some actually what we think is relatively robust homeless counts, but that is parallel to the census effort. So those are some of the populations that are ended up at risk being undercounted, and you don't know how many people are actually out of their homes in that sense. How many people in here actually have used census data in the past, either to make a point, in a grant proposal, or in some other context? Okay, so you can see the ubiquity by which these data are used. And so one of the things as an economist is I run into census data all the time. I'm asked to analyze it, use it, report on it, try to provide ways of arguing against it sometimes. For example, in commuting data, there's a very large fight that goes on between two parts of the Census Bureau. One which looks at the longitudinal employment and housing data and their dynamics, which is called LEHD, and then the actual census through the American Community Survey, which have very disparate results on how the movement of people in some places. Marin County is one of those places. So the census is used in a lot of different ways in the business context to think about the flow of people, where they live, how they live, retail settings. It's enormous, the amount of different permutations there are out there. The second question is to talk about which populations are the most at risk, and I think it's relatively easy to just say the underrepresented groups in our communities. The homeless are another one. Another group which is currently under an effort in California to form an economic council is the LGBTQ communities, to try to figure out ways in which they can generate more data that's useful for their own advocacy, where other data gathering seems to not really pick up a lot of what they need to answer questions to help in their efforts. So we're seeing a lot of different communities look at this Census 2020 as a way to really build bridges to better communications, better data generation, and just really making better decision making. One example of this is in median income. So in fact, when you undercount your population, you may overstate the income level, which then can shift resources, as the last two speakers talked about at length. So that's one of the things we want to watch very closely, is how Marin County ends up potentially looking very, very good on paper, which then leaves behind folks that aren't looking very, very good on paper because they're undercounted. And those that will be most impacted will probably be generally the underrepresented, lower income groups, the folks that are homeless, and those that just will, in a sense, have higher risk of not being part of the census at all. So we need to see the importance of this and really get it right in 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Paul, would you weigh in on the political components?
Happy to. So I was also asked to start by addressing a couple of questions. First is, how does census data inform political representation at the local, state, and national level? You heard a little bit about this, but I'll dive just a little bit further into it. First of all, census data is the tool that's used, so it is fundamental to district representation at every level of government. The big picture is the Constitution requires the census to count all persons, and then reapportionment or reallocation of congressional seats between the states to follow the census. So it affects congressional seats by state, and it affects the Electoral College, because Electoral College votes are congressional seats plus Senate seats. So you can imagine the impact. For example, if the census resulted in California losing two seats in Congress, and Texas gaining 2 seats. That's a 4-vote swing in the House of Representatives and a 4-vote swing in the Electoral College, just because of the census count. So the census is mandated to happen every 10 years, and reapportionment is mandated to happen every 10 years. I'll talk more about this later on, but 100 years ago, reapportionment was delayed by almost a decade in violation of the Constitution for political gain. States rely on census data to draw districts, although the methods used within states are up to the states. In California, since 2008, we've had a Citizens Redistricting Commission, but they still rely on census data. And again, think about allocation of state legislators' seats. Well, are they in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, or are in the Central Valley? That affects the political makeup and the political divide of those legislative bodies. Local government uses census data. After the 2020 census, county supervisorial seats in Marin County will be redrawn based on those numbers. Increasingly, as a result of the California Voting Rights Act, local governments are being pushed to adopt district elections, demographers use population data by census block as the foundation for district maps. I was engaged by the Canal Alliance at the beginning of this year when, under threat of lawsuit, the city of San Rafael decided to adopt district elections. The initial set of maps did not include a district with more than 31% Hispanic voting population. We were able to get the city to adopt a map that got that number up to 39%, but unsuccessful in getting a map adopted that would have increased the number to 42%, which would have created a district with a plurality, not a majority, but a plurality of Hispanic voters greater than the white non-Hispanic voters in that district. Finally, only a minute left, but and we'll come back to this if there are questions about it, but modern campaigns use this data for targeting. Modern campaigns use data to figure out who to talk to, when to talk to them, and how to talk to them. And even in local campaigns, we engage in targeting. Census data often informs that. I ran a mayor's race in Vallejo in 2016, where the last contested election had been a number of years prior, and there had been dramatic demographic shifts within the community, and we were able to analyze census data to figure out where our efforts needed to be focused. I actually had two candidates, one for mayor, one for city council. One was Filipino, the mayoral candidate was African American, and they focused in different parts of the city because of the demographic data that we had, which is not part of the voter file. Finally, one of the challenges that campaigns face, the richest source of data for us is the voter file. We know who votes, what method they use to vote, mail at polling place, and how often they vote. So I can distinguish people who vote in every election from people who vote in presidential elections, from people who vote in gubernatorial elections, from people who vote in who vote in every single election, including all local elections. We can target based on that, and we often do to conserve resources. The challenge is we end up not talking to the people, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because we're not talking to the people who are not voting. And so an organizing perspective would push us to do that. Census data can inform where those organizing efforts should be based, but again, bad data drives bad decisions, and full and accurate census is vital for fair and democratic representation at every level of government.
Great. Kristen.
So I was asked to provide the county perspective on how the census ways that the local government depends upon an accurate census count. As has been mentioned,
Kristen,
representation.
Can folks hear Kristen? Okay. There you go.
As has been mentioned, representation is a huge factor, and at the county level, we draw school district boundaries and supervisorial districts for the Board of Supervisors based on census information. Funding. We also receive a lot of federal funding that go to serve different programs in the county, including funds for hospitals, roads, schools, public works projects, such as transportation improvements that go to fund Highway 1 improvements in the Highway 101, and other programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, Section 8 housing, housing vouchers, and Head Start programs, just to name a few of many programs. John mentioned that the state of California receives about $76.5 billion. But they're at the county level, when one person is not counted, it is estimated that that translates to a loss of about $2,000 per person per year over the course of 10 years. So that's a significant loss of funding for programs for services. And also the census data is important because it provides a comprehensive source of information on population, housing, and statistics. As a planner, we use this data to track key trends and socioeconomic data and trends. And we look at how the population is growing, where it's growing, and how it's changing when we make our land use decisions. So another issue or factor is what role is the county going to take to help ensure an accurate count in Marin, including any plans to establish a complete count committee. Well, in 2000 and 2010, the county initiated and led the role for a complete count committee. And we certainly intend to lead a similar role in 2010 and 2020. There are a lot of behind the scenes work that's going on. Right now, we've updated the local update to census address, the LUCA file, which is the census address master file, to make sure that all the address that the census used is correct and up to date. And there are other programs that we are participating in to ensure that the census data is accurate. With regards to forming the Complete Count Committee, we intend to take the lead and develop a census awareness campaign and leading up to and during the 2020 census. We will administer the Complete Count Committee and develop a budget and scope. In 2010, we partnered with the Grassroots Leadership Network and collaborated with the West Marin Community Services for outreach specific to West Marin. And we intend to work with partners to collaborate on developing an awareness and outreach campaign. The 2010 Complete Count Committee was structured more as a volunteer committee. We had over 60 community-based organizations, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, businesses, and government agencies who participated. And we held quarterly meetings to discuss strategies to reach to these hard-to-count areas. As we mentioned, the 2010 census focuses on 4 targeted hard-to-count communities, and we've talked about those. And then through the Community Outreach Support Program, we received funding, about $500 to $4,000, where we could, nonprofits could provide, we can get grants to do additional marketing. And then I'd like to point out that our complete count for 2010, we successfully reached over 20,000 households and 70,000 individuals throughout the county through our collective outreach efforts. At the time, Marin achieved a 75% rating, which I think now that it's been changed to 80%. And we exceeded both the state and national rates and was one of the highest by the county in the Bay Area for census response rates.
Wonderful. Great, thank you all. So we are going to shift into a moderated discussion, and what I hope will happen is that the answers start to come from any number of the panelists as they are moved to respond. And you still have a chance to submit questions if you'd like. We have a few coming in, and we also had some through pre-registration. So I'm going to get us started by asking Leah. You know, you mentioned the benefits of having a digital platform, but we are also keenly aware of the cybersecurity risks and privacy concerns. So can you talk about the new cybersecurity policy of the Census Bureau and how you're planning to protect data from hacking attempts, as well as what respondents can do to ensure their data is protected? Leah?
Yeah, it's interesting when you go from a mail-out, mail-back survey to a digital survey, and in this time and age when that cybersecurity becomes an issue. But I want you to know that the Census Bureau, we recognize the concerns and that perceptions are out there. Our intention is on maintaining public trust, because that is the only way that we can have an accurate census and get a full count. But it's also the only way that we can do all the 100 other surveys that we do, like the American Community Survey. We have to maintain public trust. We can't have an infraction or someone's information being hacked. We have a robust program to protect your information as we do a couple of things. As we process it, as we store it in our secure IT systems, we limit access to only authorized users for statistical purposes only. We follow federal IT security standards. In those IT security standards that are set by NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, including the encryption of data in transmission and at rest. Responses are on a private internal network. That network is isolated from the public by firewalls and other security measures. We actively monitor our internal network and audit the use of our IT systems to make sure your information stays secure. And however, if people are still concerned about, going online, by all means, they can call the questionnaire assistance line, or they can request a paper questionnaire as well.
Fabulous, thank you. There's one question coming from Novato, and this I think points to the nuance around identifying hard-to-count communities. We see the orange zones on the map, and Novato doesn't show up as a hard-to-count community, but we know that there are growing numbers of persons of color in Novato, and a growing younger population. So how do you think about those kind of dispersed hard-to-count populations? And is it helpful for us to think in a targeted way for the census tracts that are identified, or should we be thinking more broadly around hard-to-count populations that might not be showing up on these maps?
Aimed at anybody in particular?
I'd say start with Leah or John, or jump in as you, and maybe that's a question that is a follow-up question if we don't have a ready answer.
So can folks hear me? All right, so as I mentioned in my presentation, it's a both and. We need to be looking at those hard-to-count census geographies, and those are obvious places where resources should be targeted, but we also need to look at those. We need to take a broader approach and also look at hard-to-count populations, which is harder. You have to be able to identify where folks who fall into hard-to-count populations and where they are. You can get that potentially from some data sets, but your richest source of information will be community groups. So there should be direct service providers or schools who know what their community looks like. And so for those who are going to be doing outreach, it's connecting with those folks, connecting with those service providers, connecting with schools who interact with those communities to say, hey, this isn't necessarily a census tract with a high or very high LRS score, but there's some indication that there are folks from hard-to-count populations living there.
Great, thank you. Yes?
Yeah, so I can follow up on that with an anecdote from the debates over the map in the city of San Rafael. So, in the attempt to address the challenge posed by the California Voting Rights Act, not disenfranchise groups historically underrepresented, obviously it made sense to look at a district focused around the Canal neighborhood, and then the question was, what areas do you add to that to come up with a district so population is relatively balanced between the 4 districts within the city? Through some good work talking to community folks, not done by me, but surfaced by folks who really went into the community and talked to community groups, it was identified that there was a section of San Rafael, basically a finger up along Lincoln Avenue, parallel to Highway 101, that would dramatically increase the numbers. And in fact, then when we pressed the issue and the demographers advising the city went and looked at the disaggregated data below the census tract level, they were able to verify at the block level that was correct. And at first there was resistance, that looks like gerrymandering, where we were like, the point is to draw a district that fairly, maximizes the opportunity for fair representation. And you have folks in this community you're trying to give representation to that live outside of what you think is the place. And if you draw a district that includes those, you maximize that potential. And that's in fact, although we didn't quite get the map we wanted, the map that was adopted does have a finger that runs up along parallel to Highway 101 on the west side of the freeway to maximize that population.
And I think I mentioned earlier that, the purpose of the CPEP or the Census Engagement Partnership Program is to reduce the differential undercount. And we miss people of certain subgroups and disproportionately, and to improve cooperation with enumerators, and to really focus on the hard-to-count population. I mentioned that we're going to have a robust advertising campaign. It's like actually $510 million. That's our integrated communications campaign. And we're spending an additional $248 million on our partnership program. So we're going to be the staff, this 300+ people going out, identifying those trusted messengers, finding those churches, those community centers, working with complete count committees in particular to identify areas with hard-to-count populations, utilizing the low response score or any other tool that more are becoming accessible in time. Because again, it's a grassroots conversation. And one of the things, just listening to Tom Peters on looking at the word count, I said, we really got to bring a human face to a number story. What's in it for me? And that's the job of partnership. That's the job of the trusted messengers. That's the job of the complete count committee. So let's bring a localized message. In addition to the advertising campaign that the Census is doing, the campaign that the state will be running, what can we do locally to really bring us all together to have an intimate conversation about why it's important to get counted and what it means to this community?
Absolutely, that's a good one.
The questions are coming in. This is exciting. Okay, so question about the homeless population. How are they accounted for or represented, including folks who may be staying on someone's couch, right? They're not necessarily connected to services. Anybody want to take that?
So, Kristen, you may have more on the way that they do the homeless count specific to the county of Marin, but in general, one of the biggest question marks since the Great Recession for both demographers and economists has been trying to figure out how household formation is happening and whether or not in the midst of rising home prices, in the midst of slow-moving wages, are we not seeing people form, quote-unquote, and this is going to sound very academic-y, households, they're forming households in ways that they used to not. So one way of thinking about that is instead of having 2 people in a 2-bedroom apartment, now you've got 4 people in a 2-bedroom apartment because it reduces the rent by half, if you will, right? Math's pretty simple to think about that. San Francisco is sort of a key place in which demographers and economists are sort of pointing and saying there has to be something going on here. So one of the ways of getting that sort of third-party data is actually start looking at cell phone data and trying to say, well, Department of Finance is counting it this way, Census is counting it this way through the American Community Survey. If we start to look at cell phone counts under the assumption that most people in urban areas like San Francisco would actually have cell phones, will we actually discover something different about household formation by counting the cell phone pings at certain times of the day? So commuting data is starting to look at cell phone data as a way of thinking about the flow of people and not relying on ad hoc counting in terms of just let's put a wire in the ground and let's see how many cars run over it, but actually thinking about watching the flows over time. It's possible that we'll see third-party data emerge that is a little bit more robust in terms of saying, wow, okay, that makes sense, because if 97% of people in an urban area have a cell phone, we may be able to count the way they're forming households a little bit more deeply. And that's one of many examples, but to come around to my main point, when you think about the so-called homeless, that continuum has a lot of stops discretely along the way from being literally outside to being marginally outside to actually being a homeowner in a 5,000 square foot home. There's a lot of stops along the way in terms of buckets that we count, and trying to grab onto how many of those types of people are sort of one paycheck away from being off that couch or out of that shared bedroom is a tricky task for anybody, but it's something that it'll be intriguing to see if that emerges from the 2020 census.
And you want to say something?
Yeah, one of the programs that our Complete Count Committee worked with in 2010 and will work with in 2020 is there is a program called the Service-Based Enumeration. Of course, that's to reach out to those populations where, for those service providers to count those who may not, are hard to count. For example, in Marin, St. Vincent de Paul feeds a lot of the homeless, and so we coordinated, they coordinated with the census to go out on a certain day to visit places where they're known to camp, and then also when they came in for meals to count them for the census. And then we also do we call it precariously housed for those who are like in transition. So that is part of that program.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's one of the values again of having a complete count committee is we can really have a dialogue about if there are homeless in Marin County. I don't think there are any, are there? Just guessing, just joking. I mean, like when I come on the freeway, I see places all over. I mean, there's definitely been an increase in homelessness in California, period. I mean, it's shocking. So one of our big programs is group quarters enumeration and service-based enumeration, where we're gonna identify those soup kitchens, those shelters, and those targeted non-shelter outdoor locations. And one of the projects that we could work on is that point in time count where there's individuals that have a sense of where these populations are. That's one. Service-based enumeration, that's one of our data collection activities. The thing on messaging, maybe one of the benefits of having a digital census is that you will receive a letter and you have a census ID, and it asks you to put everybody that lives in that housing unit on the census form if you're filling it out for the household, and the person who rents or owns the home fills it out for the entire household. But however, maybe you're not talking to the person that you're renting the room from. There's non-ID response. You can go online, put in 112 Main Street, Leah Bowden, and I can be counted at that address. So I think part of that is going to be some messaging, and then also the messaging that we don't share information, with the housing authority or any law enforcement about code compliance or anything like that. So messaging is going to be huge. Also, if you look at the 2018 census form, just go online and pull it off now. You can take a look at it. One of the questions we have on it is what a cover question is, have you counted everybody that lives here, that's sleeping here? So it is based on the concept of usual residence. So so maybe one message would be if you have someone couch surfing, put that beautiful human being on the form. Make sure that person gets counted.
Great, thank you. A burning question for many is the citizenship question. Paul, can you lead us off around implications, pros and cons? And then I have a follow-up question.
Sure, although I'm not sure what the pros are, but I'll do my best. So one thing I was thinking about today was, since, randomly November of 2016, a lot of people that I know have said in response to a series of outrages, this is not who we are. A better way to put that, in fact, is this is not who we aspire to be, because in many ways, this is who we are. I mentioned the 1920 census, 100 years ago, and the lack of reapportionment for 9 years. So I'll tell you, 100 years ago, the national debate was filled with incendiary rhetoric about immigrants destroying America. The language that was used would be familiar today. The targets of that language were different. The origin of the folks that was aimed at were different, but the language was as awful as language that we hear today, directed at whether it's people, Spanish-speaking people or people who faith of Islam. And in fact, I was thinking of a personal connection. I consider myself a person of privilege. I'm certainly going to be identified as a white male. I've been an elected official. I'm financially stable. My father came to this country through Ellis Island, fleeing Russia during the Russian Revolution. And in case you hadn't figured out from my name or other physical characteristics, I am Jewish. My family was the target of that rhetoric 100 years ago, which makes me feel very much for the people who are the target of it today. But let us not pretend this is somehow new and not who we are. This is serious stuff. And Congress, 100 years ago, literally ignored the Constitution of the United States for almost a decade by refusing to fund reapportionment. So, in light of the current context in this country, I think there is no doubt that the citizenship question has potential to impact the count and result in undercounting. I think it's done for that reason. It may be a less blatant effort than simply ignoring the Constitution, but I think it's aimed at the same end. John talked about a lack of trust as being one of the challenges. Frankly, under the current administration, if you are an immigrant, it is rational to not trust the federal government. So, you think about the national implications. There's a potential undercount population in states with higher immigrant population, and so overweight states with lower immigrant populations. Look at a map and the political makeup of the United States, you'll get some clues about why that might be a motive for those currently in power. Locally, again, to draw it back to the local level, has a tremendous potential to impact San Rafael district elections, because guess what? After 2020, and the census is complete, San Rafael has to redraw those districts they just drew using new census data in time for the 2022 city council elections. And those districts will hold for 10 years until the 2030 census. So if the census undercounts people of color, the new districts will be, no doubt, less representative than they should be. By the way, we're at a university, so those of you interested in the history I'm referring should do a remarkable thing, read a book. It's called Last Call by Daniel Okrent, and it's the history of prohibition in this country, and it's a fascinating story.
So a follow-up question to the citizenship is, people want to know, can they just leave that question blank? And a question in relation to that is, if we know they will overcount, should we over-report? So it goes to the question of kind of the reliability of data, and in particular, what is leaving the citizenship question blank? I should say, if it ends up on the form, there are 5 or 6 lawsuits that are challenging the question being on the form, and that hasn't been yet decided. But if it does end up there, what happens to someone's form if they don't fill that question in? Leah, do you want to answer for us? Or do you have an answer?
Yeah, historically, there's always been item non-response. In the 2010 census, I think it was like 2 to 4% of people not answering all the questions or leaving some questions incomplete. So it did not preclude anyone from being counted. So not answering a question on the form does not preclude you from being counted. However, the more questions you leave unanswered will increase the possibility that you will get an in-home visit, from a census worker. Or a telephone call, or they can impute data with administrative records. But I think the bottom line is it does not preclude you from being counted. And, so the main thing is we want people to be counted.
Great.
And we want good data.
And we want
need
good data.
We have to rely on our data. We also, once we do a complete count, we have a parallel operation called post-enumeration survey, where we actually have to measure the work of the enumerator to make sure someone's just not making up some answers. So we test our work, and that's how we also are able to establish the undercount. Okay, so we want to be able to rely on census data. It's very important that we're able to do that.
Great. 2 more questions to round us out here. With special attention to West Marin, and rural communities and challenges associated with that. For instance, P.O. boxes or second units that are now short-term rentals. What are the particular challenges or ways that you address the challenges in rural context? Krista?
No, please.
A lot of, in West Marin, everyone receives mail at P.O. boxes. The mailman does not deliver mail to your house. So the census just drops off forms at the post office box, or the post office, is that correct, Leah? I believe that happens. And so a lot of residents may not get the form. And so we have to do a lot of messaging and targeting to ensure that they do receive the form. And actually one of the cities, Ross, has the same issue. They get all their mail at P.O. boxes too. So that's one issue we need to have the complete count committee look at to ensure we're making sure that those residences are counted.
Yeah, and with some irony, my family is from West Marin County. They're sheep and cattle farmers. They live on the south side of the Estero. Their P.O. box is on the north side of the Estero in Sonoma County. So there's some of that little bit of, that's just a little twist. But I think that to Chris's point's bigger than this in terms of regional. Rural California has this challenge regardless of where it may be. West Marin County is just an example of how rural California is going to struggle with some of this stuff, especially for communities where the preponderance of their connectivity is through a P.O. box. So anyway, that's just kind of a neat little twist if you know the Dillon Beach Valley Ford area.
Yeah, and if you have a non-city style address, as Christian said, you will fall into update leave, where we actually send an enumerator on, they leave the form, at the address. You fill it out and send it back. However, if you are in the post office's delivery sequence file and you get mail at a P.O. box, you will get notification. You will get census notification. So if you got a census letter that says, okay, your your ID to fill out the census form is this, please fill it out. Then we want to encourage people to do that. So messaging is going to be huge for that.
Great. And last question to bring us home is, what can nonprofits, faith communities, business sector, and individuals who are not necessarily considered hard to count do to help ensure a fair and accurate count in Marin? How can they get involved?
I guess that's directed to me. Nonprofits, faith community, and businesses, they all have one thing in common. They are the trusted messenger for those who identify with or use their services. They have established networks that can be leveraged, and they are already connected with the people in their communities. So we encourage them to participate in the complete count committee that we will be administering. And some of the examples that in 2010 that some of the nonprofits did to do outreach. For example, the Marin Asian Advocacy Project, they went door to door to do outreach. And in their activities, they reached about 300 to 500 families. The Marin City Golden Gate Village Resident Council in Marin City, they did also door-to-door outreach, and they also handed out flyers and presentations at their meetings. And so they were able to at least reach every household in Marin City. The Canal Alliance, for example, they did outreach at their English as a second language computer classes, and they had messaging at their monthly youth program retreat, and they did food bags, and they also did messaging on their website. So these are just examples of the messaging that can be done within your own services that you provide to reach your target areas to get the word out.
So I just want to reiterate that point, that for the nonprofit community, what nonprofits can do is commit to developing and implementing an outreach campaign. So in LA County, we've been working with nonprofit organizations to develop those campaigns. We developed an overall framework that lays out the history of what's been done, what the factors are now, and then a strategy for 2020. The strategy we have is a 4-phased one. There's preparation, education, activation, and follow-up. We're encouraging nonprofit organizations to be planning now to launch campaigns, outreach campaigns that are 12 to 15 months. And so these campaigns start in April of 2019 and end July of 2020. So we're saying organizations need to be planning now. Launching campaigns in April of 2019. April to December is the education phase, and the focus there is general education, awareness raising about the census. Again, a lot of folks don't know about the census. They don't know why it matters. Much of 2019 should be addressing that. Hey, the census is coming up. Here's what it is. Here's why it matters. Then the third phase, that activation phase, is July to April of 2020, and that's where organizations shift from general education to more direct contact. And at that point, organizations will be doing neighborhood canvassing, phone banking, hosting, in LA County, they're going to be called census action kiosks, but they're more generally called questionnaire assistance centers. but that more direct contact to motivate people to actually self-respond. And trying to get as many people to self-respond leading up to Census Day 2020 as possible, just up to and just after Census Day 2020, which is April 1st. The fourth phase is the follow-up phase, and that corresponds to the Census Bureau's non-response follow-up operation. And that's roughly April 2020 to July 2020. And there, same tactics in terms of phone banking, neighborhood canvassing, hosting census action kiosks, et cetera, but the message shifts. At that point, it's, hey, if you didn't fill out your census, here's what you can expect. You can expect that the Census Bureau may contact you. Be aware of that. And changing that message in an attempt to try to reduce fear and anxiety, and to just make sure that people are informed about what's happening with the enumeration operation.
I just want, I'm excited. I mean, I'm just so excited that Canal Alliance hosted this event today, and it's going to take some energy, right? And Christian, it's going to take some energy to mobilize our community. So one of the things our ask is, decide to be a force in your community's readiness to be counted in the 2020 census. Decide to be a force, whether you're a business, community-based organization, if you go to a church, maybe you can enroll your minister. I mean, we need to just talk up the census to really bring a human face to this number story. I also, Christian talked about a complete count committee. The complete count committee can really help mobilize and organize and create that space that John talked about to bring your community together. Invite us, Census Bureau staff, to be at exhibits, conferences, events, planning meetings to talk up the census, to hand out promotional materials, just to be a fly on the wall. But just have our presence here so they can get to know these grassroots people that we're hiring, that are coming from our community. And then, apply for census jobs. There's going to be lots of jobs. They're $20 to $30 in some cases, some of it more than that for some of these office management positions. So help us recruit a diverse staff, knowing that who do we want knocking on the doors? We want people from the community that love their community, that want to see a full and accurate count. So help us do that. And I'm an optimist. I got to be an optimist, or I tell my husband I can't get up tomorrow. I mean, I got to believe, in the possibility of tomorrow. I got to believe that people recognize democracy when they see it. And the census is at the core of our American form of democracy. So it's how we do reapportionment. It's how we decide on our leaders. It's so important, and we have to be a voice like, yeah, fill out the form. You go online now. Make a difference in your community. And when they see your excitement, it's contagious, and it will make a difference.
Excellent. Perfect place to stop. Please join me.
One quote.
Paul wants the last word, and then Omar will bring us home.
It is not the foundation of American democracy. It is the foundation of democracy. Pericles, an Athenian spokesman, said, just because you do not take an interest in politics does not mean politics doesn't take an interest in you. We need to convince people that representation matters, whether they know it or not.
Fabulous. Omar? Great.
Hello everyone, my name is Omar Carrera. I'm the Executive Director of Canal Alliance. Thank you. So many people to thank, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight and being interested to learn more about the census and the impact it's going to have in our community. I want to thank MCF, Dom and Patty, thank you for your leadership and commitment to our community. To the panelists, thanks for your time and for sharing your wisdom and expertise with all of us. It was very inspirational and definitely empowering. To Canal Alliance staff, thank you for organizing this event. It was a lot of work, so thank you for that. I want to thank our partners. Without them, none of this will happen. So I'm going to mention of them. Marin Economic Forum, North Marine Community Services, Marin County Office of Education, Dominican University Service Learning Program, Marin City CDC, and West Marine Community Services. And also I want to thank somebody who's very special to us. Carla, where are you again? Thank you. Thank you. Carla played a very important role during the research, planning, and organizing this event. She is a Dominican student, business management student, and she is a powerhouse. Thank you, Carla. I believe the census is the cornerstone of our democracy. The federal government has a constitutional obligation to count all people living in our country, whether they are citizens or non-citizens, whether they were born in the United States or in a distant place in the world. All Americans have a stake in fair political representation and in the effective use of tax dollars to meet community and national needs. But those with the most to lose, people who are members of disadvantaged and marginalized communities, are the greatest risk of being uncounted. As a result, their communities will not receive the political influence and resources that they deserve and need. Please stay connected with Canal Alliance. You have the website and the information in the back of the program. And again, thanks for coming tonight. And let's make sure that everyone gets counted, because everyone counts. Thank you.